The slap of a fist against soft skin echoed through the airplane cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the air. A woman screamed. A little girl, no older than 7, let out a sharp, pained cry, clutching her cheek where the man's knuckles had just landed. The world seemed to freeze for a split second. Passengers twisted in their seats, turning toward the commotion. Flight attendants dropped what they were doing. A baby somewhere in the back began wailing. The man who had struck the child, a balding, red-faced businessman in a stiff, button-down shirt, gritted his teeth, his chest heaving. His hand was still clenched in a fist, his knuckles slightly reddened from the force of the punch. His nostrils flared as he glared down at the little girl, his lip curling in disgust. "Shut that brat up," he spat. The girl's mother, Janice Carter, gasped in horror and yanked her daughter into her arms, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "You hit my baby. You," her voice caught in her throat, a mix of rage and fear overtaking her. The passengers closest to them were frozen in shock. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others had pulled out their phones, recording what had just happened. Then, another sound, a seatbelt unbuckling. A man stood up a few rows back, his expression calm but his body coiled like a spring. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a plain gray t-shirt that barely concealed the power in his arms. His piercing eyes locked onto the businessman like a predator sizing up its prey. Logan Shaw had seen enough. The former Navy officer moved fast, his heavy boots thudding against the plane's floor as he strode forward. His jaw was set, his hands flexed at his sides. The air in the cabin had changed. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, that sent a silent message. "This ends now." The businessman barely had time to react before Logan reached him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Logan's voice was dangerously low, yet everyone could hear it. The businessman scoffed, turning toward him, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes now. "Mind your own business," he sneered. Logan's face didn't change. Hitting a child is everyone's business. The businessman rolled his eyes, trying to mask his discomfort with arrogance. "That little brat wouldn't shut up. Kids like that." "Don't finish that sentence." Logan cut him off. His tone was steel, unbreakable. The tension in the cabin thickened. The mother clung to her daughter, shaking. The little girl's wide, teary eyes darted between the man who had hit her and the stranger who had come to her defense. Passengers were now whispering in hushed, urgent tones. Some reached for the call buttons above their seats. A flight attendant hurried toward the scene. Logan took a single step closer to the businessman, his shadow falling over him like a dark cloud. And then, the businessman lunged. Just a few hours earlier, the flight from Atlanta to Seattle had started like any other. The passengers had filed in, one by one, dragging their luggage down the narrow aisles, bumping elbows, searching for their seat numbers. The air smelled like coffee, recycled air, and the faint scent of someone's too-strong cologne. The cabin crew smiled and directed people to their seats, reminding them to stow their bags and fasten their seatbelts. The familiar hum of the engines rumbled beneath their feet. Janice Carter sat near the middle of the plane, placing a small pink backpack on the seat beside her before helping her daughter, Ebony, into her seat. Ebony, a bright and cheerful 7-year-old, swung her little legs back and forth excitedly. Her hair was styled in neat braids, decorated with colorful pink and purple barrettes that clicked softly as she moved. She was thrilled. This was her first time flying. "Mommy, are we in the sky yet?" she asked eagerly, peering out the window even though the plane hadn't taken off. Janice chuckled. "Not yet, baby. We have to wait for the pilot." Ebony grinned, bouncing in her seat. "I can't wait. I want to see the clouds." Across the aisle, a man shifted in his seat, already irritated. Todd Whitaker, middle-aged, dressed in expensive business casual. A man who thought the world owed him something. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the armrests. He didn't like kids, and he especially didn't like this kid. From the moment Ebony had sat down, he had been watching her. The way she smiled, the way she talked, the way she giggled as she flipped through the in-flight magazine. He hated it. By the time the plane was in the air, his patience was wearing thin. Every time Ebony spoke, even in a whisper, He clenched his jaw tighter. When she laughed, he closed his eyes, exhaling sharply through his nose. And when she sneezed, "Oh, come on," he muttered, shaking his head in disgust. Janice turned her head. "Excuse me?" Todd sneered. "Is it really that hard to keep a kid quiet? Some of us want to relax." Janice's expression darkened. She had met men like this before. Cold, rude, racist. "She's just excited," Janice said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "She's never flown before." "I don't care," Todd snapped. "Tell her to be quiet." Ebony shrank into her seat, her hands gripping the edges of her dress. Janice took a slow breath. She knew that snapping at this man would only make things worse. "I'll try to keep her quiet," she said evenly. Todd huffed, shaking his head. "You people always have an excuse." Janice froze. Ebony blinked up at her mother, confused. "What do you mean, you people?" Janice asked, her voice sharper now. Todd just smirked. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. A few rows behind them, Logan Shaw shifted in his seat. He had been watching Todd from the moment he boarded. He had noticed the stiffness in his posture, the irritated glances toward the little girl, the way his fingers twitched as if itching to grab something. Logan had seen this before. He didn't like where it was going. So, he waited. He watched. And when Todd finally snapped, when his hand shot out, striking a child, Logan moved. Todd's body twisted as he lunged toward Logan, his eyes blazing with fury. The airplane cabin erupted in chaos. Gasps, screams, the sound of a tray table slamming shut. Passengers recoiled, some gripping their armrests in fear. But Logan was faster. Before Todd could even get close, Logan stepped to the side, dodging the wild attack like a seasoned fighter. Todd's own momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled, nearly falling onto the lap of a terrified woman in the next row. "Sit down." Logan's voice was low and dangerous, the kind of voice that made grown men think twice. But Todd wasn't thinking. He was seeing red. His pride was wounded, and in front of all these people, he refused to back down. "You don't tell me what to do." Todd spat, straightening up. His face was a deep, ugly red, veins pulsing in his forehead. He clenched his fists again, his knuckles white. Logan stared at him, unblinking. "You just hit a child. You think I'm going to let that slide?" The cabin crew had rushed forward now, 3 flight attendants trying to push through the gathering crowd of passengers who had turned in their seats, watching everything unfold. Sir, you need to calm down," one of the attendants said, holding up her hands. "Please return to your seat." "She should shut up," Todd barked, pointing a shaking finger at Ebony, who was still sobbing into her mother's chest. "Kids like that don't know how to behave." "Kids like what?" Logan asked coldly. Todd turned back to him, his lips twisting into a snarl. "You know what I mean," Todd hissed. A dark silence filled the space between them. Logan's hands flexed, but he didn't strike. Not yet. He had been trained for this. Control, patience, strategy. But if Todd made another move, if he so much as lifted a hand toward that little girl again, "Sir, step away." A deep voice cut through the noise. A second later, 2 large men appeared. Off-duty air marshals who had been quietly observing everything from the back of the plane. Both wore casual clothes, but their presence screamed authority. Todd's head snapped around. His nostrils flared as he realized these weren't just random passengers. These were officials. "Enough," the first air marshal said. "You're done." "I'm done," Todd scoffed, incredulous. "That brat." Logan took a single step forward, and Todd shut up. "Take your seat now," the second marshal ordered, "or we will restrain you." Todd opened his mouth to argue, but Logan caught the flicker of fear in his eyes. The reality was sinking in now. This wasn't some little incident he could brush off. He had hit a child, on a plane, and everyone had seen it. Phones were recording. Eyes were locked onto him, filled with disgust and rage. Even Todd wasn't stupid enough to push his luck now. With a huff, he raised his hands as if to say fine, whatever, then turned and slammed himself into his seat. The air marshals stayed near him, arms crossed, ready to react if he moved again. Logan exhaled slowly, his muscles still tense. He turned back toward Janice and Ebony. Janice was shaking, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter, who still clung to her like a lifeline. Ebony's small body trembled, her tear-streaked face buried in her mother's chest. Logan's heart clenched. He crouched beside them, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you two okay?" Janice nodded shakily, but her eyes shone with tears. She's scared," she whispered. "I'm scared." Ebony peeked up at him, her lip quivering. Logan could still see the red mark on her cheek where Todd had struck her. It made his stomach turn. "You're safe now," he told them. "I promise." The little girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her pink sweater. Why does he hate me?" she asked in a tiny voice. Janice squeezed her daughter tighter, her breath hitching. Logan's jaw clenched. He had seen too much of this in the world, too much hate for no reason. But Ebony was too young to carry the weight of that answer. "Sometimes," Logan said carefully, "people are just mean, and it has nothing to do with you. It's their problem, not yours." Ebony looked down at her hands, processing his words. Then, quietly, she whispered, "He called me a brat." "He's wrong," Logan said firmly. "You're brave." The little girl hesitated, then gave the tiniest nod. A flight attendant knelt beside Janice, her face full of concern. "We've already notified the captain," she said softly. "We're making an emergency landing." Janice's eyes widened. "We're landing early?" "Yes," the attendant nodded. "In Denver. Authorities will be waiting." Janice glanced toward Todd, her fear spiking. "What if he's not getting near you again," Logan assured her. And he meant it. Passengers whispered in hushed tones. Some still held their phones up, filming Todd as he sat there, glaring at the seat in front of him, his jaw tight. He was fuming, but he wasn't moving. The cabin intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an onboard incident, we will be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. We ask that all passengers remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for descent." The tension in the plane thickened. A woman across the aisle leaned toward Janice, reaching out a tissue. "That man is disgusting," she murmured. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." Janice accepted the tissue with a grateful nod. "Thank you," she whispered. The plane shuddered as it began its descent. Todd shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then shot a glare toward Logan. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Logan smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You're right," he said. "It's just beginning." Todd's eye twitched. He glanced around, realizing he was completely alone. Not a single passenger was on his side. The wheels of the plane hit the runway with a sharp thud. People let out breaths they had been holding. Outside the window, flashing red and blue lights sped toward the aircraft. Janice's grip on Ebony tightened as the plane taxied to a stop. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Denver. Law enforcement will be boarding shortly. Please remain seated." Silence fell over the plane. The door opened, and then the police stepped in. The moment the airplane door swung open, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The bright uniforms of the Denver police officers were a sharp contrast to the dim lighting of the airplane. They moved quickly and efficiently, their faces unreadable as they stepped inside. The lead officer, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern expression, scanned the cabin. "Where is the suspect?" he asked in a voice that commanded immediate attention. A flight attendant pointed toward Todd Whitaker, who sat stiffly in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Todd's face was a mask of forced calm, but his eyes flickered with something that looked like panic. "I didn't do anything wrong," he blurted out before the officers even reached him. Logan, still standing a few feet away, folded his arms and watched with quiet satisfaction. The officer barely acknowledged Todd's outburst. "Sir, please stand up." Todd hesitated. "Now," the officer added, his voice sharper. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, some still holding up their phones to capture the moment. Todd exhaled sharply and stood, trying to keep what little dignity he had left. He straightened his expensive shirt, as if that could somehow erase what he had done. "I was just defending myself," Todd said, turning toward the officer. That kid was being obnoxious, and her mother. Save it. The officer cut him off. You are being detained for assaulting a minor on a federal flight. Todd's mouth opened and closed. The color drained from his face. Wait, assault? Logan smirked. What did you think was going to happen? Todd's head snapped toward him, his nostrils flaring. This is because of you, isn't it? He sneered. You think you're some kind of hero? Logan didn't even blink. I don't think, I know. Before Todd could spit another word, the officers moved in. Turn around, one ordered. Todd hesitated, his entire body twitching like he wanted to fight, but he knew better. He glanced at the rows of people watching him, some recording, others whispering. No one was on his side. Gritting his teeth, he turned. The officer grabbed his wrist and snapped a pair of metal handcuffs around them. The clinking sound sent a ripple of relief through the cabin. Todd stiffened at the cold touch of the cuffs. This is ridiculous, he hissed, his face red with humiliation. Sir, you are under arrest, the officer stated. You have the right to remain silent. Oh, this is insane, Todd shouted. He turned his head, looking for anyone who would defend him. His eyes darted toward the woman across the aisle. You saw everything. Tell them that Brat was making a scene. The woman scoffed. What I saw was you acting like a monster. A few passengers clapped. Others nodded in agreement. Todd's mouth twisted in rage. Janice, still holding Ebony close, kept her eyes on Todd but said nothing. She had no more words left for him. The officers began leading Todd down the aisle toward the exit. As he passed Janice and Ebony's row, Todd turned his head, his eyes locking onto the little girl he had hurt. Ebony shrank back, fear flashing in her eyes. Todd opened his mouth, and Logan stepped in front of him. He didn't touch Todd. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, a wall of muscle and quiet authority. You don't get to look at them, Logan said, his voice as sharp as a blade. Todd glared up at him, but Logan didn't move. After a long, tense pause, Todd finally dropped his gaze. Keep walking, the officer instructed. And just like that, Todd was marched off the plane, his wrists bound, his fate sealed. Passengers exhaled as the tension finally broke. Some applauded. A few even cheered. Janice let out a shuddering breath, her arms still wrapped around Ebony. Is he gone? Ebony whispered. Logan turned, kneeling beside her again. He gave her a reassuring nod. Yeah, kiddo. He's gone. She swallowed hard, but she didn't smile. Her tiny fingers clutched at her mother's sleeve. What if he comes back? Logan's jaw tightened. He won't. The police have him now. Janice stroked Ebony's back, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're safe, baby, she whispered. A flight attendant approached, kneeling beside them. Is there anything we can do for you? She asked gently. Janice hesitated. I don't know. She looked down at Ebony, who still looked shaken. Maybe some ice for her cheek? Of course, the attendant said. Already moving. Passengers began shifting in their seats, whispering among themselves. Some looked at Janice with sympathy. Others shook their heads in disgust. Not at her, but at what had happened. A man across the aisle spoke up. If you need a witness, I recorded the whole thing, he said, holding up his phone. Just say the word. Janice's lips parted in shock. She had barely processed the fact that this wasn't just an isolated moment. This was a crime. Thank you, she managed, her voice shaky. The flight crew moved through the cabin, making announcements. They explained that passengers could remain seated while things were handled on the ground. Some people groaned about the delay, but most were still too rattled to complain. Logan stood back up, glancing toward the open door where Todd had been led away. The sight of the man in handcuffs had given Logan some satisfaction, but he wasn't done. He turned to Janice. Listen, he said, keeping his voice low. When we land in Seattle, the police might want a statement from you. Maybe even the airline, too. Janice nodded slowly. I figured. I'll be there, Logan said firmly. Janice blinked at him. You don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. Because guys like him? They get away with this stuff all the time. His gaze softened just a little. And I don't want him to get away with hurting your little girl. Janice's throat tightened. She looked down at Ebony, who was still curled into her side. The little girl wasn't crying anymore, but she was silent, too silent. Janice exhaled. Thank you. A flight attendant returned, holding a small ice pack wrapped in a napkin. She handed it gently to Janice, who pressed it against Ebony's cheek. Ebony winced, but she didn't complain. Logan crouched again, so he was eye level with her. You doing okay, kiddo? Ebony nodded faintly, but her little hands were still shaking. Logan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a challenge coin, an old one from his Navy days. It was gold with an intricate engraving, something he'd kept for years. He placed it in Ebony's tiny palm. You hold on to this, he told her. It's a lucky coin. For brave people only. Ebony looked at it, then at him. But I'm not brave. Logan smiled. Yeah, you are. Ebony curled her fingers around the coin. For the first time since the attack, a tiny hint of a smile touched her lips. Janice's eyes shimmered with tears. Thank you, she whispered again. The flight crew announced that they would be taking off again soon, now that Todd had been removed. Passengers settled in. But Logan? He stayed right where he was, watching over them, just in case. The engines rumbled as the plane prepared for takeoff once again. The tension in the cabin had shifted. It was still there, lingering like an unwelcome guest, but now it was mixed with relief. The threat was gone. And yet, Janice still couldn't relax. She sat stiffly in her seat, her arm wrapped around Ebony, who was staring down at the challenge coin Logan had given her. The little girl traced the engraved pattern with her small fingers, her brows furrowed in deep thought. Logan, seated just across the aisle now, kept an eye on them. He could tell that even though Todd was off the plane, the fear he had caused hadn't left. Everything okay over here? A flight attendant asked softly, kneeling beside Janice. Janice hesitated, then nodded. We're okay. Ebony didn't say anything. The attendant smiled gently. If you need anything at all, just let us know. Janice gave a quiet thank you as the attendant walked away. The plane taxied down the runway, picking up speed, and then, whoosh! They were in the air once again, heading toward Seattle. But the fight wasn't over yet. Janice tried to focus on anything other than what had just happened. She stared out the window, watching the clouds drift below them. She tried to breathe slowly, to calm herself, but her mind wouldn't let her. He hit my daughter. She had never been in a situation like this before. Never had someone treated her child with such hatred. And she had never been this afraid. Mommy. She looked down. Ebony was staring up at her with wide eyes. Yeah, baby? Ebony hesitated, gripping the coin in her tiny fist. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she asked, Is he coming back? Janice's heart shattered. She cupped Ebony's face gently, smoothing her fingers over her soft skin. No, baby. He's not coming back. But what if? He won't. Logan interrupted from across the aisle, his voice calm but firm. He's gone. And he's going to stay gone. Ebony looked at him, searching his face. Promise? Logan leaned in, lowering his voice like he was telling her a secret. I promise. Ebony finally exhaled, her little shoulders relaxing, just a little. She uncurled her fingers and looked at the coin again, as if it really could keep her safe. Janice swallowed hard. Thank you, she whispered to Logan. You don't have to thank me, he said simply. It's what anyone should do. But Janice knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stepped in. Not everyone would have put themselves between her daughter and a dangerous man. She looked at Logan, really looked at him. There was something about him, something steady and unshakable. He didn't just protect people because he had to. He wanted to. Janice took a deep breath, finally letting the tension in her shoulders drop just a little. But the moment didn't last, because that was when the intercom crackled to life again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just been informed that authorities in Seattle will be waiting for our arrival to speak with any passengers involved in the earlier incident. Janice's stomach dropped. Ebony gripped her hand. Does that mean we have to see that man again? She whispered. Logan's expression darkened. No, he assured her. That means the police are making sure he pays for what he did. Janice's mind raced. What would happen now? Would she have to go to court? Would Ebony have to relive this all over again? She bit her lip, looking toward the back of the plane where the flight attendants were huddled in quiet conversation. They kept glancing toward her row. She had the horrible feeling that this wasn't over. An hour passed. Most of the passengers had settled down, though the atmosphere wasn't the same as it had been before the attack. There were still whispers, still murmurs of conversation about what had happened. Some people stole glances toward Janice and Ebony, their faces filled with sympathy. Logan stayed alert, watching everything. He had been in situations like this before. Not on a plane, not with civilians, but he knew how people acted after a fight. And he knew the real battle wasn't over yet. Janice barely touched the in-flight meal that was placed in front of her. Ebony poked at her apple slices with a plastic fork, her appetite gone. Logan, however, ate like normal. He needed to keep his strength up. He had a feeling he'd need it. Then, another announcement. We'll be landing in Seattle in approximately 30 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Janice tensed. Logan glanced at her. You okay? She forced a nod. Yeah. He didn't believe her. Listen, he said, leaning in slightly. When we land, stick close to me. I don't trust how this is going to play out. Janice looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Logan's jaw tightened. I don't think Todd's going down without a fight. Janice's stomach twisted. Ebony pressed against her mother's side, her little fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. She didn't know exactly what Logan meant, but she could feel that something was wrong. The plane descended lower and lower. The city lights of Seattle glowed beneath them, stretching as far as the eye could see. Janice's heart pounded as the plane wheels touched the ground. And then, the moment they rolled up to the gate, the first thing she saw through the window was a line of uniformed officers waiting just outside. She swallowed hard. This was far from over. The seatbelt light turned off, and passengers immediately began standing, grabbing their bags. But instead of heading for the exit, many of them turned to Janice. You need anything from us? One man asked. I saw everything. I'll tell them exactly what happened. Same here, a woman added. I recorded part of it on my phone. If you need it, just let me know. Janice's throat tightened. Thank you. Ebony clutched her mother's hand tighter. Mommy, I'm right here. Baby, Janice whispered. The flight attendants opened the door, and the police stepped inside. A tall officer with a no-nonsense expression scanned the cabin before his eyes landed on Janice and Ebony. Ma'am, he said, we need to speak with you. Janice froze. Logan immediately stepped closer. She's not saying anything without a lawyer. The officer's gaze flickered to him. And you are? Someone who saw everything. A tense silence settled between them. Then, the officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Look, no one's in trouble here. We just need statements. This is serious. Logan didn't move. Janice hesitated, looking down at Ebony, who was practically glued to her side. She had a choice to make. Stay quiet, or fight back. And then, a voice boomed from outside the plane. A voice she recognized. You can't do this to me. I didn't do anything wrong. Todd. He was still here. Ebony's fingers dug into Janice's arm. Mommy. Logan's entire body went rigid. The officer sighed. We need you to come with us now. Janice's breath hitched. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to face him again. But now, she had no choice. The sound of Todd's voice sent a chill down Janice's spine. You can't do this to me. I didn't do anything wrong. His rage echoed through the airport terminal, growing louder with every second. Passengers still inside the plane turned their heads toward the open door, eyes widening at the scene unfolding just outside. Some pressed against the windows to get a better look, their phones already recording. Janice's breath hitched. He's still here. Her arms instinctively tightened around Ebony, who trembled against her side. Logan didn't hesitate. He moved to stand between Janice and the open door, his body a shield. His muscles were tight, his hands flexing at his sides. He looked ready for a fight. The lead officer in front of them sighed, muttering something under his breath before looking at Logan. Let's not make this more complicated than it already is. Then keep him away from them, Logan said, his voice like stone. The officer nodded sharply, then stepped outside. Janice held her breath. Through the open doorway, she could see everything. Todd was standing in the middle of the terminal, his face red with anger, his hands still in handcuffs. But that didn't stop him from fighting. He twisted in the officer's grip, his body jerking as he tried to yank himself free. "This is a joke," Todd shouted. "I was defending myself."
"That brat was."
One of the officers shoved him forward.
"Enough."
Todd's head snapped back toward them, his gaze landing directly on the plane. And then, he saw Janice. His expression twisted into something ugly. His lip curled. His eyes burned with pure hatred. Janice's stomach turned. She could tell exactly what he was thinking. He hated that she had power over him now. But then, Todd's gaze shifted to Ebony. The second his eyes landed on her daughter, Janice lost it. "You don't look at her," she snapped, her voice breaking with fury. Her own words shocked her. She hadn't even thought before she said them, but she meant it. Todd actually laughed. A cruel, mocking sound. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You people." Boom. Logan moved. He didn't hit Todd, but he got close. In a single step, he closed the distance between them, towering over Todd with an expression so deadly that even the officers holding Todd flinched. The terminal went silent. "You say another word," Logan said quietly, "and I promise you, you will regret it." Todd's mouth snapped shut. For the first time since this started, he looked scared. Logan leaned in just a little, his voice low enough that only Todd could hear him. "You think you're tough?" he murmured. "You're nothing. I've seen men twice your size fall apart the second they realize they're not in control anymore. And guess what, Todd?" Todd swallowed hard. "You're not in control." Todd's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the side, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the officers weren't looking at him. The passengers weren't looking at him. Everyone was looking at Logan. Todd had lost. He knew it. The officers yanked Todd back toward the security checkpoint, dragging him away as he continued to spew nonsense, his words weaker now. Janice felt like she could finally breathe again. She turned to Logan, her hands still shaking. "Thank you." Logan didn't take his eyes off Todd's retreating figure. "It's not over yet," he muttered. Janice swallowed hard. She knew he was right. The airport security team led Janice, Ebony, and Logan through a private corridor, away from the main crowd. A female officer, her expression soft but serious, sat them down in a quiet room near the police station inside the terminal. "I know this has been a long day," she said, sitting across from them, "but we need to get official statements before you leave. We also want to make sure you're safe." Janice nodded, her grip tightening on Ebony's hand. "Of course." Ebony sat curled against her mother, still holding onto Logan's coin like it was the only thing keeping her together. The officer's eyes flickered toward Logan. "And you are?" "Logan Shaw," he said simply. "I was sitting a few rows back. I saw everything." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll take statements from all of you. And just so you know, there's a strong chance this will go to court." Janice inhaled sharply. "Court?" she repeated. The officer nodded. "Todd Whitaker is being charged with assaulting a minor and disrupting a flight, both of which are serious offenses. His case will go through a legal process, and your testimony is going to be crucial." Janice's stomach twisted. She wanted justice, but this meant reliving it. She glanced down at Ebony. The little girl had already been through so much. Would testifying make it worse? As if sensing her mother's hesitation, Ebony whispered, "I want to tell them what happened." Janice's heart squeezed. "You sure, baby?" Ebony nodded. "He was mean to me. I want them to know." Janice swallowed the lump in her throat, brushing a curl from Ebony's face. "Okay," she whispered. Logan, who had been silent, finally spoke. "We're not letting him get away with this." The officer nodded. "Good. Because trust me, people like him, they don't stop unless someone stops them first." Janice clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not after what he did to her daughter. "All right," she said, straightening her back. "Let's do this." Logan smirked just a little. "That's what I like to hear." The officer pulled out a notepad. "Let's start from the beginning." Janice took a breath, and the fight for justice began. The small interview room inside the airport terminal was quiet, except for the scratching of the officer's pen as she wrote in her notepad. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. The air was thick with tension. Janice sat with Ebony tucked against her side, her daughter still holding onto Logan's challenge coin like a lifeline. Logan sat across from them, his expression unreadable. His fists rested on his thighs, but his fingers twitched slightly, a subtle sign that he was still running on adrenaline. The officer, who had introduced herself as Detective Karen Ellis, adjusted her glasses and looked up from her notes. "Let's start from the beginning," she said. "Mrs. Carter, can you walk me through what happened on the plane?" Janice inhaled sharply. She hated thinking about it. She hated reliving it. But she had no choice. She glanced down at Ebony, who was looking up at her with wide, tired eyes. For her, Janice would do this. "All right," Janice said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It started the moment we got on the plane." And so, she told the story. She recounted how Todd had glared at them from the start, how he had huffed and rolled his eyes every time Ebony spoke, how his resentment had simmered beneath the surface until it finally boiled over into violence. When she got to the part where Todd hit her daughter, Janice's breath hitched. Ebony flinched, curling into her mother. Logan clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening. Detective Ellis didn't interrupt. She just listened, her pen moving quickly over the paper. When Janice finally finished, the detective turned to Logan. "And you? You were the first to intervene, correct?" Logan nodded. "I was watching him the whole time," he said. "I knew he was going to snap. I just didn't know when. And when he did," Logan's expression darkened. "I stepped in before he could do worse." Detective Ellis looked over her notes, nodding slightly. "There's more than enough here to charge him. The evidence is strong, especially with all the passenger recordings." Janice swallowed. "So, what happens now?" The detective set her notepad down. "Todd Whitaker will be formally charged within the next 24 hours. There's no way he's walking away from this. He'll likely spend tonight in holding before going before a judge." Janice felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. "And after that?" Detective Ellis exhaled. "It depends. His lawyer will probably try to negotiate a deal, but given the severity of what he did, assaulting a child on a federal flight, the DA won't go easy on him." Logan smirked slightly. "Good." Detective Ellis leaned forward, her gaze serious. "But here's where you come in. If this goes to trial, you'll both need to testify." Janice's stomach twisted. "Testify?" The detective nodded. "We need your official statements for the legal process. That means appearing in court and telling the judge exactly what happened." Janice bit her lip. She wanted justice. She needed it. But could she really put Ebony through this? As if sensing her thoughts, Ebony sat up straighter, her fingers still wrapped around Logan's coin. "I want to tell them," she whispered. Janice's breath caught. "Baby, you don't have to." "I want to," Ebony said, her voice stronger this time. "I don't want him to do it to someone else." Janice felt her heart swell with both pride and sorrow. Ebony was braver than she had ever realized. Janice nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, baby. We'll do this together." Detective Ellis smiled faintly. "You're one strong little girl," she told Ebony. Ebony blinked up at her. "Logan said I was brave," she murmured. Logan grinned, ruffling Ebony's hair gently.
"That's 'cause it's true."
Janice exhaled slowly. "So, what do we do now?" The detective stood. "For now, you go to your hotel, rest, and wait for further instructions. You'll be contacted soon about the next steps." Janice nodded, standing up as well. Ebony followed, gripping her mother's hand tightly. Logan stood last, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of everything that had just happened. "Where's Todd now?" he asked. Detective Ellis smirked slightly. "Locked up and holding. And judging by the way he was running his mouth, he won't be getting out anytime soon." Logan nodded in satisfaction. "Good." Janice looked at him. "You don't have to keep helping us, you know." Logan met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he said, "Yeah, I do." Something about the way he said it made Janice's chest tighten. She didn't argue. She just nodded. And together, they left the airport, stepping into the cool Seattle night. knowing this was far from over. The ride to the hotel was quiet. Janice sat in the back of the taxi, one arm wrapped around Ebony, who was staring out the window. The little girl's fingers toyed with Logan's challenge coin, flipping it over in her palm again and again. Logan sat beside them, silent, his gaze locked on the passing city lights. None of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened, what was still happening, settled on their shoulders like a heavy, invisible force. Janice's mind was racing. Todd was in jail, but the thought didn't bring her the relief she thought it would. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. When they arrived at the hotel, Janice carried Ebony inside, her daughter half asleep in her arms. She felt the exhaustion deep in her bones, but she knew she wouldn't be getting any rest tonight. Logan stayed close behind them, his eyes scanning the lobby. Even now, after everything, he was still on alert. It made Janice feel safer. They checked in quickly. The hotel staff had already been notified of their situation. Detective Ellis must have made arrangements, so there were no questions, no delays. They were handed a room key, and within minutes, they were inside. The hotel suite was nice, more luxurious than anything Janice had ever stayed in. A large king-sized bed sat in the middle, flanked by plush chairs and a sleek desk. A second room branched off to the side with a smaller bed, perfect for Ebony. But Janice barely noticed any of it. She was too busy lowering Ebony onto the bed, tucking the blankets around her. The little girl stirred. "Mommy," she murmured. Janice ran a hand over her braids. "I'm right here, baby. Just sleep." Ebony's eyes flickered toward Logan, who was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're staying, right?" she asked sleepily. Logan hesitated. Janice waited for his answer, holding her breath. Finally, Logan nodded. "Yeah, kiddo," he said softly. "I'm staying." Ebony gave a small, sleepy smile before her eyes fluttered closed. Janice exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from Ebony's face. She watched her daughter for a long moment, making sure she was truly asleep. Then, she turned to Logan. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Logan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I do," he said, echoing his words from earlier. Janice crossed her arms. "Why? You don't even know us." Logan studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I've seen people like Todd before," he said. "I know what happens when nobody stands up to them." Janice swallowed hard. She knew he was right. Besides, Logan continued, "He's not the only threat." Janice frowned. "What do you mean?" Logan pushed off the doorframe, his posture tense. "Todd's rich, Janice. He's not going to sit in a cell quietly. Guys like him? They've got connections. Money. Power. They find ways out." Janice's blood ran cold. But she shook her head. Detective Ellis said they had more than enough evidence to charge him. "They do," Logan agreed. "But don't think for a second that Todd's not going to fight this. His lawyers are probably already working to get him out on bail." Janice's chest tightened. "And if he gets out?" Logan's expression darkened. "Then we have a problem." Janice didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She had thought Todd was gone, that this nightmare was over. But Logan was right. Todd wasn't the type to accept defeat. He was the type to fight back. And she had a sick feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. At 7 a.m., the hotel phone rang. Janice shot upright, her heart pounding. She grabbed the receiver, her voice still thick with exhaustion. "Hello? Mrs. Carter?" Janice froze. She knew that voice. It was Detective Ellis. "Yes," she said quickly. "What's going on?" There was a pause. Then, the detective sighed. "It's Todd," she said. Janice's stomach dropped. "What about him?" she whispered. There was another pause, and then, "He's out on bail." Janice's blood turned to ice. Janice's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. "He's what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Detective Ellis sighed on the other end of the line. I know this isn't the news you wanted to hear, but his legal team moved fast. His family posted bail early this morning." Janice felt the room tilt. Her stomach churned. "But he hit my daughter," she snapped, her voice rising. "How is he walking free?" "The system isn't perfect, Mrs. Carter," Ellis said, her tone regretful. But listen to me. Just because he's out doesn't mean he's off the hook. The charges still stand. There will be a trial. We still have a case. Janice ran a shaky hand through her hair, glancing toward Ebony, who was still sleeping peacefully in the next room. She didn't feel relieved. She felt trapped. She took a deep breath. So what happens now? We need to be careful, Ellis said. I don't want to alarm you, but Todd Whitaker is a man with resources. We have to assume he's going to fight this, maybe even try to intimidate you. Janice swallowed hard. You think he'll come after us? A pause. Then, I don't know, but I don't want you taking any chances. Stay at the hotel. Keep a low profile. If anything feels off, call me immediately. Janice's fingers tightened around the phone. Understood. I'm assigning extra officers to watch him, Ellis continued. He won't be able to make a move without us knowing. But that doesn't mean he won't try something. Janice closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. Thank you, Detective, she murmured. We'll talk soon, Ellis promised. Then the line clicked dead. Janice sat there for a moment, gripping the receiver, trying to process what she had just heard. Then, he's out, isn't he? Janice turned her head sharply. Logan was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression grim. Janice exhaled. Yeah, he made bail. Logan clenched his jaw. Knew it. Janice stood now, pacing. What do we do? She demanded. Do we leave? Do we stay? If he comes after us. He won't touch you, Logan interrupted. Janice stopped pacing. She turned to him, eyes filled with uncertainty. How do you know that? Logan stepped forward, his voice low but steady. Because I won't let him. The room went silent. Janice studied him, searching for cracks in his confidence. She found none. You don't have to do this, she said softly. You don't even know us. Logan's jaw tightened. You said that before. And I told you. I do have to do this. Why? Logan hesitated. Then, finally, he said, because I've seen what happens when no one steps in, and I won't let that happen again. Something flickered in his eyes, something haunted. Janice felt her breath catch. He wasn't just talking about her situation. He was talking about something from his past. She wanted to ask, but now wasn't the time. Instead, she just nodded. Okay, she whispered. Logan's shoulders relaxed slightly, like he had been expecting her to fight him on this. But how could she? She wasn't stupid. She knew that having him around was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. 9:30 a.m., the news breaks. Janice was pouring herself a cup of coffee when her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. Turn on the news. Now. Her stomach tightened. She didn't know who had sent the message, but she had a bad feeling. Logan must have sensed it because he stepped closer. What is it? Janice grabbed the remote, flipped on the TV, and turned to the first news channel she could find. And then, she saw his face. Todd Whitaker, plastered all over the screen, looking smug as ever, standing outside the jail, his lawyer beside him. Janice's blood boiled. The news anchor's voice cut through the static in her head. Todd Whitaker, the wealthy businessman accused of assaulting a child on a Seattle-bound flight, was released on bail early this morning. His legal team is pushing back against the charges, calling them exaggerated and unfair. Janice gripped the counter. Are you kidding me? Logan's eyes narrowed. Wait, listen. The camera zoomed in on Todd as he spoke. And then, this is ridiculous, Todd said, his voice filled with arrogance. I was attacked first. That man, he pointed at the camera, assaulted me before I could defend myself. I plan to sue. Janice's stomach dropped. No, 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 no. The anchor continued. Whitaker's legal team is claiming self-defense, arguing that the viral video only captured part of the story. Janice's hands shook. He's turning this around on us? Logan snorted. Of course he is. It's what cowards do. But Janice wasn't laughing. She was terrified. What if people believed him? What if this case got thrown out? She turned to Logan, her voice barely a whisper. What if he wins? Logan's expression turned deadly. He won't, he said. Janice swallowed hard. How do you know? Logan turned back to the TV, watching Todd's smug face. And then, he said something that sent a chill down Janice's spine. Because I don't lose fights. Later that afternoon, the media exploded. By noon, their names were everywhere. People were talking. Some were furious, outraged that Todd was trying to play the victim. Others, however, were doubting the story. Do we really know what happened? Was the punch really that bad? Was it self-defense? The comments flooded in. Social media was a war zone. Janice felt sick. People were debating whether or not her daughter had deserved to be hit. She turned off her phone, fighting the urge to scream. Logan, who had been monitoring everything, sat on the edge of the hotel desk, scrolling through his own phone. His jaw was tight. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. Janice rubbed her temples. "What do we do?" Logan was silent for a moment. Then, he stood. "We fight back." Janice blinked. "How?" Logan pulled out his own phone. "We go public." Janice's stomach clenched. "You mean, an interview?" Logan nodded.
Exactly.
Janice hesitated. She didn't want attention. She just wanted justice. But maybe this was the only way. She looked at Ebony, who was coloring in the corner of the room, oblivious to the war unfolding around her. Janice took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." Logan smirked. "Good." He tapped his phone screen, dialing a number. Within seconds, someone answered. Logan's voice was calm. "We're ready to talk." Janice sat stiffly on the hotel couch, her fingers laced together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had never been on TV before. She never wanted to be. But here she was. Logan stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, talking in a low, serious voice. "Yeah, we want it live," he said. "No edits. No spin. If they can't do that, we'll take the story somewhere else." Janice swallowed hard. She still couldn't believe this was happening. This wasn't what she wanted. All she had wanted was a peaceful flight, a fun trip with Ebony. But now the whole country was watching, and people were taking sides. She had seen the social media posts, the news articles, the debates. People were arguing over whether or not Todd was the real victim. Some called her a liar. Others said Ebony was being dramatic. It was just a slap. Kids exaggerate. Are we sure she wasn't acting up? Janice wanted to scream. Her baby had been hurt, and now the world was treating it like some kind of game. Logan hung up the phone. "They're sending a car," he said. "We're going live in an hour." Janice exhaled shakily. "I don't know if I can do this." Logan's sharp eyes softened. He crouched down in front of her, resting his elbows on his knees. "You can," he said simply. Janice let out a dry, humorless laugh. "How are you so sure?" Logan smirked. "Because I've seen you fight for Ebony. And if you can stand up to a man like Todd on a plane full of strangers, you can sit in front of a camera and tell the truth." Janice wanted to believe that. But the truth was, she was terrified. She didn't like attention. She didn't want her face plastered all over the news. But if she stayed silent, Todd would win. And that was unacceptable. Janice inhaled deeply, straightened her back, and nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's do this." Logan grinned. "That's what I like to hear." An hour later, the live interview. The new studio was bright. Too bright. Janice sat in the middle of the sleek, modern set, Ebony tucked beside her, her tiny hands clutching Logan's challenge coin like it was her lifeline. Logan stood behind the cameras, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across from them sat Leah Monroe, one of the top reporters in the country. Her brown eyes were sharp, but her smile was kind. She wasn't here to trap them. She was here for the truth. "Mrs. Carter," Leah began, her voice smooth and professional. "Can you walk us through what happened on that plane?" Janice took a deep breath. And then, she told everything. From the moment Todd glared at them, to the hateful words, the tension that built, and finally, the moment he hit Ebony. Leah's face darkened. "And what was your reaction?" Janice's throat tightened. She glanced at Ebony, who was staring down at the coin in her lap. "I couldn't believe it," Janice whispered. I didn't think something like this could happen, that a grown man could hit a child. My child." The audience watching at home felt the raw pain in her voice. Leah turned to Ebony gently. "Ebony, Sweetheart, she said softly, do you want to say anything? Ebony hesitated. Janice almost told her she didn't have to, but before she could, Ebony lifted her head. She stared straight at the camera, her voice small but firm. I just want people to know, she said, that I didn't do anything wrong. Silence. The weight of her words hung in the air. Janice's eyes burned with tears. Logan's grip on his arms tightened. Leah blinked rapidly, clearly affected. Ebony, you are so brave for sharing that. Ebony looked down again, biting her lip. Leah turned back to Janice. And now, Todd Whitaker is claiming self-defense. That he was the one attacked first. What do you say to that? Janice's hands curled into fists. I say he's a liar. The sharpness in her voice caught even Leah off guard. Janice leaned forward slightly. He's trying to flip the story, she said. He knows he's guilty. He knows the whole world saw what he did. And now he's trying to make people doubt the truth. Leah nodded. And what do you say to those who think Todd should get a second chance? Janice's face hardened. He already got too many chances. The audience watching at home felt that. She wasn't just talking about Todd. She was talking about every man like him. Men who used money and power to dodge consequences. Not this time. This time, he would face justice. Leah turned toward the camera. We reached out to Todd Whitaker's legal team, but they declined to comment. Janice wasn't surprised. Because what could they say? The truth was out now, and people were listening. 1 hour after the interview, back at the hotel, Janice and Logan sat in the hotel lounge, staring at the screen. The news was replaying their interview. Clips were going viral. People were talking. Logan's phone buzzed. He glanced down. Dozens of messages. From reporters. From lawyers. From people offering support. We did it, Janice murmured, still in disbelief. We actually did it. But Logan didn't look relieved. He was still staring at his phone. Janice frowned. What is it? Logan exhaled sharply, then turned the screen toward her. Janice's heart stopped. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Todd Whitaker seen leaving his attorney's office. I'm going to win this. Janice's stomach twisted. He's fighting back, she whispered. Logan's expression was ice cold. Let him try, he said. Janice wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew this was far from over. And the next battle was coming. Fast. The hotel room was quiet. Too quiet. Janice sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. The interview had exploded. Social media was on fire. Hashtag Justice for Ebony was trending. People were furious over what Todd had done. Thousands of messages of support poured in. Strangers were sending words of encouragement. Others were demanding that Todd be locked up immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, Janice felt like they weren't alone. But that feeling didn't last. Because Todd had fired back. The first thing Janice saw when she refreshed the news was a headline that made her stomach drop. Todd Whitaker's attorney says client plans to countersue for defamation. Janice's hands trembled as she clicked on the article. It was a statement from Todd's legal team. Mr. Whitaker has been falsely accused and vilified in the public eye. The claims against him are exaggerated, and the media's one-sided coverage has destroyed his reputation. He will be pursuing legal action for defamation and emotional distress. Janice's blood turned cold. He's suing, she whispered. Logan, who had been sitting across the room, looked up. What? Janice turned the phone toward him. Logan's eyes darkened as he scanned the screen. That son of a... He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. I knew he'd try something. But this? Janice swallowed hard. Can he actually do this? Logan hesitated. Technically? Yeah. But it won't hold up in court. Janice's heart pounded. Are you sure? Logan looked her dead in the eye. Yeah. He hit your daughter. There's video evidence. No judge is going to take his countersuit seriously. But that's not the point, Janice whispered. Logan nodded grimly. No. The point is to scare you. Janice clenched her jaw. She wouldn't let Todd win. Not like this. She stood up, inhaling deeply. Okay, what do we do now? Logan smirked slightly. We call a lawyer. 1 hour later, Janice sat across the table from Andrea Collins, a high-profile civil rights attorney who had taken an interest in their case after seeing the interview. Andrea was sharp, professional, and most importantly, she wasn't afraid of Todd Whitaker. "You have nothing to worry about," Andrea said, flipping through some documents. "Todd's lawsuit is nothing more than a desperate attempt to flip the narrative. But can he drag this out?" Janice asked anxiously. Andrea sighed. "He can try. And I won't lie to you, it'll be a fight. But he's already lost in the court of public opinion. No amount of legal threats will change that." Janice let out a slow breath. "So, what do we do?" Andrea folded her hands. "We counter. We hit back. And we make sure he never gets to hurt another child again." Logan leaned forward. "What's the next step?" Andrea smirked. "We file a civil suit." Janice blinked. "What?" Andrea nodded. "We're not just going to defend ourselves against his nonsense lawsuit. We're going on the offensive. We're going to sue him for assault, child endangerment, and emotional distress." Janice's stomach flipped. "But won't that drag this out even more?" "Yes," Andrea admitted. "But it'll also ensure that he is the one on the defensive, not you." Janice hesitated. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ebony. Could she handle putting her daughter through this for even longer? Then, she felt a small tug on her sleeve. She looked down. Ebony was staring up at her, her little hand still clutching Logan's coin. "Mommy," she whispered. "I don't want him to get away with it." Janice's heart clenched. She turned back to Andrea, her shoulders straightening. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." The next morning, Janice had barely gotten a few hours of sleep when Logan burst into the hotel room holding his phone. "You need to see this," he said, his face tight with anger. Janice sat up quickly, grabbing the phone from his hand. And then, her stomach dropped. It was a video. Todd was sitting in what looked like a fancy office, dressed in a suit, looking calm and collected. A woman, probably his PR rep, sat beside him. And then he started talking. "I just want people to know the truth," Todd said smoothly. "This has been blown out of proportion. I would never hurt a child. But that man, Logan Shaw, he assaulted me first." Janice's blood boiled. "The media has painted me as a monster, but no one is asking the right questions. Why was this man, someone trained in combat, allowed to put his hands on me? Why am I the one being punished?" Janice wanted to scream. He was turning it all around. Again. And people were listening. She scrolled down to the comments. Some were still on her side. But others? Others were starting to doubt. Wait, did Logan actually hit him first? What if they really are exaggerating? "We need to see the full video before we judge." Janice clenched the phone so hard that her hands shook. "He's trying to put this on you now," she said, looking up at Logan. Logan's expression was unreadable. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured he'd try." Janice swallowed hard. And what if people believe him? Logan let out a slow breath, his hands resting on his hips. "Then we remind them of the truth." Later that afternoon, Janice was sitting on the bed, feeling completely drained, when Logan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and suddenly froze. Janice frowned. "What?" Logan's lips slowly curled into a grin. "You need to see this," he said. He handed her the phone. It was a new video, from a different angle. Someone, another passenger, had recorded everything. Not just the moment Todd hit Ebony, but the moment before. In the footage, Todd was seen standing up aggressively before Ebony even moved. He was already angry, already clenching his fists. And then, clear as day, he lunged first. Not at Ebony, at Logan. Janice's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. Logan smirked. "Looks like Todd just buried himself." Janice's pulse raced. This was it. This was proof. And this time, Todd wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, it was everywhere. News stations picked it up. Social media platforms flooded with reposts. People who had doubted Janice and Ebony were now backpedaling, fast. Because now, there was no denying the truth. Todd lunged first. He wasn't an innocent victim. He was a violent, hateful man who had attacked a child. And the world had proof. Janice sat on the hotel bed, phone clutched in her shaking hands, as she watched the reaction unfold in real time. People who had once questioned her were now furious, not just at Todd, but at themselves for ever doubting her. I take back everything I said. Todd is a monster. We all saw it. He wasn't provoked.
He went after them first.
Lock him
up.
Janice exhaled, her heart pounding. This was it. They had him. She turned to Logan, who was standing by the window, scrolling through his own phone. You were right, she whispered. The truth won. Logan didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the screen, his jaw tight. Janice frowned. What is it? Then, his phone buzzed. He answered without hesitation. Yeah. A voice crackled on the other end. Detective Ellis. Logan, tell Janice to pack her bags, Ellis said quickly. Janice's stomach dropped. What? Logan asked, his voice sharp. Ellis's voice was dead serious. Todd's out on the loose.
He skipped town.
Janice froze. Her heart stopped. He's gone? Logan's grip on his phone tightened. How the hell did that happen? He demanded. Ellis sighed. He was supposed to report back for a check-in with his bail officer. He never showed. His attorney claims he doesn't know where he is, but that's bull. The second that video dropped, Todd knew he was screwed.
He ran.
Janice's pulse skyrocketed. Her breath caught in her throat. Todd was out there. Somewhere. And worse? He was angry. She turned to Logan, panicked. What do we do? Logan didn't hesitate. We move, he said.
Now.
Janice stuffed clothes into a suitcase, her hands shaking. Ebony sat on the bed, eyes wide with fear. She could sense that something was wrong. Mommy, she asked, her voice small. Why are we leaving? Janice forced a smile. We just need to go somewhere safer, baby. That's all. Ebony clutched Logan's challenge coin, holding it close to her chest. Is it because of the bad man? Janice's heart twisted. Before she could respond, Logan crouched down in front of Ebony. Hey, kiddo, he said gently. I know things are a little scary right now, but I promise you, we're not gonna let anything happen to you. Ebony's lip trembled. You promise? Logan nodded, dead serious. I promise. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out and grabbed his hand. Janice's throat tightened. Logan had been a stranger to them not long ago. But now, he was their protector. They left through the back of the hotel, avoiding the front entrance. A black SUV was waiting for them. Ellis had arranged for an off-duty officer to drive them somewhere safe. Janice climbed into the back seat, pulling Ebony close. Logan slid in beside them, his eyes constantly scanning the area. As the SUV pulled onto the road, Janice exhaled. They were safe. For now. But Todd was still out there. And she knew this wasn't over. Not until Todd Whitaker was locked away for good. Later that night, the safe house was small and secluded. Ellis had set it up for them, just a temporary place to stay until Todd was caught. But Janice couldn't sleep. Neither could Logan. They sat in the small living room, the only sound being the distant chirping of crickets. Then, Logan's phone rang. Janice's breath hitched. Logan answered. Yeah. A pause. Then, Ellis's voice came through. We found him. Janice's stomach clenched. Logan's jaw tightened. Where? Another pause. Then, he's coming for you. Janice's blood turned to ice. Logan shot to his feet. What? Ellis's voice was tense. We intercepted a message from one of his associates. He's been ranting about how they ruined his life. He's blaming you, Janice. And he's blaming Ebony. Janice felt sick. Logan's eyes hardened. How far away is he? Ellis's voice was grim.
We don't know.
Silence. Then, you need to be ready. Janice couldn't breathe. Todd was coming. And this time, he wouldn't stop until one of them was destroyed. Janice's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Todd was coming. Somewhere out there, he was hunting for them, blaming her and Ebony for his downfall. She gripped the phone tightly. How do we stop him? She whispered. Detective Ellis sighed. We're tracking him, but he's slippery. We have a unit sweeping the city, but until we know his exact location, you and your daughter need to stay put. Janice swallowed hard. And if he finds us first? A pause. Then Ellis spoke, her voice firm. Then you do whatever you have to do to stay safe. The call ended. Janice's hands were shaking when she set the phone down. She turned to Logan, who was already moving, checking the locks, scanning the windows, securing the safe house like a fortress. "We have to be ready," he muttered. Janice exhaled shakily. "What do we do?" Logan looked at her, his expression dead serious. "We fight back." The hours crawled by. Janice couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Todd's face, twisted in rage, eyes full of hate. Ebony slept on the couch, curled up beneath a thick blanket. Logan sat near the window, a knife strapped to his belt, his gun laid out on the table. Janice had never been so scared in her life. Then, a noise. A car engine. Outside. Janice's stomach dropped. Logan's head snapped toward the window. He moved fast, shutting off the only lamp in the room, throwing the entire place into darkness. He grabbed Janice's arm, pulling her down beside the couch. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Janice barely had time to process before. Bang! The front door shook. Janice slapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Ebony whimpered in her sleep, but Logan placed a hand on her shoulder, keeping her still. Another bang. Then, Todd's voice. "I know you're in there." Janice felt her chest tighten. Ebony woke up, eyes filled with terror. Logan motioned for silence. Todd's footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. He was pacing, breathing heavily. "You ruined my life," he spat. "All because of some stupid brat." Janice's rage ignited. Her baby wasn't stupid. Her baby didn't deserve this. Before she could move, Logan stood up. "Stay here," he whispered. Janice grabbed his wrist. "Don't go out there." Logan's jaw tightened. "I'm not letting him get to you." Then, he moved. He slipped through the kitchen, pressing himself against the wall beside the back door. Janice couldn't breathe. Then bang. Todd kicked the door open. Janice screamed. Ebony buried her face in her mother's chest. And then chaos. Todd stepped inside, wild-eyed, furious, his hands balled into fists. "You think you won?" he snarled. "You think the whole world is on your side? You have no idea who you're messing with." Wham! Logan hit him first. A single, explosive punch to the jaw sent Todd staggering back. But Todd recovered fast. He lunged. Logan dodged, grabbing Todd by the arm and slamming him into the kitchen counter. The whole house shook from the impact. Todd grunted in pain, but he wasn't done. He twisted, swinging wildly. Logan took the hit to the ribs, barely flinching. Then, he struck back. A punch, a kick, a ruthless takedown. But Todd was crazy. Nothing seemed to stop him. Then, Janice saw it. Todd reached for something at his hip. A knife. Janice froze. "Logan!" she screamed. But Logan had already seen it. Todd swung, fast, vicious. Logan dodged. Barely. The blade sliced through the air, missing Logan by inches. But Todd kept swinging. Logan grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. A sickening crack. Todd howled in pain, the knife clattering to the floor. Logan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Todd by the collar and threw him straight through the coffee table. Glass shattered. Todd hit the ground hard, groaning in agony. He tried to get up, but Logan pinned him down. "This ends now," Logan growled. Todd spat blood. "You're dead, Shaw." Logan tightened his grip. "Not before you." Then, sirens. Red and blue flashed through the windows. Within seconds, officers swarmed the house, guns raised. "Freeze." Logan slowly backed away, hands up. Todd groaned, barely conscious, sprawled in the wreckage of the coffee table. The lead officer stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Todd Whitaker, you are under arrest." Todd laughed. A sick, broken, hollow laugh. "You think this is over?" he wheezed. "You have no idea who I am." The officer yanked him to his feet, snapping the cuffs tight. "Yeah?" the cop muttered. "Well, we know where you're going." They dragged Todd toward the door. As he passed, he turned one last time toward Janice and Ebony. His eyes were filled with hate. "This isn't over," he snarled. Then, they hauled him away. The door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. Janice collapsed onto the couch, shaking. Logan ran a hand through his hair, his breathing heavy. Ebony crawled into her mother's lap, silent, her little fingers still clutching the challenge coin. No one spoke for a long time. Then, finally, Janice looked up. "Is he gone?" she whispered. Logan nodded. "Yeah." And this time, Todd wasn't coming back. The courtroom was silent. Janice sat at the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. This was it, the trial of Todd Whitaker. She turned her gaze toward the defendant's table, and there he was. Todd sat stiffly in his chair, dressed in a tailored suit, his hair neatly combed. He looked different than the last time she saw him. No longer wild, no longer out of control. But his eyes were the same, cold, hateful, and they were locked on her. Janice's stomach twisted, but she refused to look away. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. Not anymore. The judge cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, please proceed with your testimony." Janice turned back to the jury, exhaling slowly. She could do this. She had to do this. For Ebony. For every person who had ever been hurt and told to let it go. She straightened her back. And then, she spoke. "The moment Todd Whitaker hit my daughter, everything changed," Janice said firmly. She looked at the jury, their faces solemn and focused. "I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't overreacting. I was a mother, protecting my child. And I won't apologize for that." Todd's lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, smirked. "Mrs. Carter, wouldn't you say that your own anxiety might have clouded your judgment?" Janice's jaw tightened. She had been waiting for this. "I would say," she said, keeping her voice even, "that any mother watching a grown man attack her child would react the same way I did. If you wouldn't, that says more about you than it does about me." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Todd's lawyer visibly tensed. Janice turned to the jury again. "We've all seen the videos. We know what happened. Todd Whitaker isn't the victim here." The prosecution lawyer nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Janice let out a slow breath as she stepped down. She had done it. She had faced him, and she hadn't backed down. Ebony takes the stand. The courtroom hushed as Ebony was led to the witness stand. She looked so small sitting there, her little hands folded in her lap. Janice's heart ached, but Ebony didn't look scared. She looked determined. The prosecutor approached gently. "Ebony, sweetheart, can you tell us what happened that day on the plane?" Ebony took a deep breath, and then, in a voice clear and steady, she said, "He was mad at me for no reason." Todd shifted in his seat. "He kept looking at me like he didn't like me," Ebony continued. "And then he hit me." Her lip trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. She lifted her chin. "And I don't know why." The jury was silent. Even the judge looked affected. Todd's lawyer hesitated before speaking. "Ebony, sometimes people remember things differently. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Ebony frowned. "If someone hit you, would you forget?" Janice grinned. Even Logan let out a quiet chuckle. Todd's lawyer stammered. "No further questions." Janice's heart swelled with pride as Ebony climbed down from the stand and ran back into her arms. "You were amazing," Janice whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Ebony beamed. "I know." The jury was out for 3 hours. Janice couldn't sit still. Logan paced the room. Ebony scribbled in her coloring book, unbothered. Then, the door opened. The bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise." Janice's hands were clammy as she stood. Todd looked nervous for the first time. The judge took a long pause before speaking. "In the case of Todd Whitaker versus the state of Washington, we find the defendant." A pause. Janice's heart stopped. "Guilty on all counts." The room exploded. A sob escaped Janice's throat. She hugged Ebony tight, pressing her forehead against her daughter's. "We did it, baby," she whispered. "We won." Todd's face twisted in rage. He shot up from his chair. "This isn't over. You think I won't appeal? You think—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker," the judge snapped. The bailiffs restrained him. Janice turned away, ignoring his ranting. He could scream all he wanted. It didn't matter. Because he lost. The media swarmed. Microphones. Cameras. Reporters shouting questions. Janice held Ebony's hand tightly as they stepped onto the courthouse steps. One reporter pushed forward. Mrs. Carter, do you have any words about today's verdict? Janice paused. She looked at Ebony, her beautiful, strong daughter. Then, she turned to the camera, and she said, "We fought back, and we won. And if anyone out there is going through something like this, don't let them silence you." She squeezed Ebony's hand. "Stand up for yourself, because the truth, it always wins." The cameras flashed. The moment was sealed in history. And just like that, it was over. The nightmare was finally over. Todd Whitaker was behind bars. The court's ruling was final. No loopholes, no appeals that could set him free. He had been convicted on all charges: assault of a minor, child endangerment, and disorderly conduct on an aircraft. The judge had denied bail. He was going to prison for a long, long time. Janice should have felt relieved, and in some ways she did. But the damage Todd had done, the fear he had caused, wasn't something that would disappear overnight. This was just the beginning of healing. 1 month later, Seattle. Janice and Ebony sat together at a quiet cafe, sipping hot chocolate. Ebony was smiling again. It was something Janice had prayed for, hoped for, every single day since the attack. They had decided to continue their trip to Seattle. At first, Janice wasn't sure if it was the right move. After everything they had been through, she thought maybe they should just go home, back to familiar things. But Ebony had surprised her. "I still want to go," she had said softly. "I don't want him to take it away from us." Janice had teared up at that. Her daughter was stronger than she had ever realized. So they had stayed. And now? Now they were doing all the things they had originally planned. Visiting Pike Place Market, riding the Ferris wheel, walking along the waterfront. Ebony still flinched sometimes when people got too close. She still woke up from nightmares every now and then. But every day, it got a little easier. A little lighter. Janice watched her daughter laugh at something in her coloring book, her tiny fingers wrapped around Logan's challenge coin. She still carried it. She still believed in it. And maybe it really had kept them safe. The cafe door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. Logan. He spotted them immediately, his signature smirk appearing as he walked over. Well, he said, setting his bag down. "You two are actually relaxing. I'm impressed." Janice rolled her eyes, smiling. "We're getting there." Ebony's eyes lit up. "Logan." She jumped up from her chair, running straight into his arms. Logan grinned, catching her with ease. "Hey, kiddo." She pulled back, holding up the coin. "I still got it." Logan chuckled. "Good. That means you're still tough." Ebony beamed. Janice watched them, her heart warming. Logan had stayed in touch after the trial. Even though his part in the legal fight was over, he had kept his promise. He had checked in, called, even sent Ebony postcards from different places he had visited. He had become family. And Janice didn't realize how much she had missed him until now. "You're back early," she said, sipping her coffee. Logan shrugged. "Had to see how my favorite troublemakers were doing." Janice smirked.
And
Logan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I think you're gonna be okay." Janice met his gaze. For the first time since this whole thing started, she believed it. The cafe door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. Logan. He spotted them immediately, his signature smirk appearing as he walked over. Well, he said, setting his bag down. "You two are actually relaxing. I'm impressed." Janice rolled her eyes, smiling. "We're getting there." Ebony's eyes lit up. "Logan." She jumped up from her chair, running straight into his arms. Logan grinned, catching her with ease. "Hey, kiddo." She pulled back, holding up the coin. "I still got it." Logan chuckled. "Good. That means you're still tough." Ebony beamed. Janice watched them, her heart warming. Logan had stayed in touch after the trial. Even though his part in the legal fight was over, he had kept his promise. He had checked in, called, even sent Ebony postcards from different places he had visited. He had become family. And Janice didn't realize how much she had missed him until now. "You're back early," she said, sipping her coffee. Logan shrugged. "Had to see how my favorite troublemakers were doing." Janice smirked.
And
Logan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I think you're gonna be okay." Janice met his gaze. For the first time since this whole thing started, she believed it. 6 months later, Janice tucked Ebony into bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her daughter looked up at her, eyes sleepy but peaceful. "Mommy?" "Yeah, baby?" Ebony hesitated. Then, "Do you think the bad man still thinks about us?" Janice's heart clenched. She didn't want to lie. She also didn't want to scare her daughter. So she said the only thing that mattered. "It doesn't matter what he thinks, baby," she whispered, "because he can't hurt us anymore." Ebony nodded, her eyes fluttering closed. Janice kissed her forehead. Then, as she walked out of the room, she saw Logan's challenge coin sitting on the nightstand. Ebony never let it out of her sight. Janice smiled. Then, she turned off the light. And as she walked down the hall, her heart full, she finally felt free. They had made it. And Todd Whitaker? He was nothing but a bad memory. The past was behind them. And the future? It was theirs. Forever. The end.